Whiskey with a Y or whiskey with an EY? We're going to talk about that and a few other things that you need to know about bourbon. So, whiskey with a Y refers to a whiskey that's been made in Scotland or Canada or even Japan. If the whiskey ends in an EY, that's referring to a whiskey that's made in America or Ireland. So these are just some of the nuances that may not seem big in the grand scope of things, but as you're looking at labels, you can kind of pick up on these things and be able to distinguish one whiskey from another. Now, is all bourbon whiskey and is all whiskey bourbon? That is the question that we're going to answer next. And the answer to that is that all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. Now, what makes a whiskey a bourbon? Well, a few things. The first thing is that bourbon is always made within the borders of the United States. It's a uniquely American spirit and must be made here. This prevents the market being flooded and saturated from other countries that are trying to mimic and counterfeit bourbon and import it. It's always made in the United States. The other thing is that it's made from a mash bill. Mash bill is another word for a grain recipe. So the grains in the mash bill are specific as to its greater amount. Does that make sense? So uh, in order for it to be bourbon, corn has to be the greatest amount at 51%. It can be more, but it has to at least be 51% corn to make it bourbon. The other thing is that when this mash bill is distilled, um, it can't be distilled any higher than 160 proof or 80% ABV, alcohol by volume. So when you look at a label, sometimes they'll have proof and sometimes they'll have an ABV number. So it might be 45 with a percentage behind it, ABV. Sometimes ABV is not there. That just means that at 45% ABV, you're looking at a 90 proof bottle of bourbon. So you double whatever the percentage is, double it, and that's the proof. So bourbon can't be distilled any higher than 160 proof or 80 ABV. So another thing that makes whiskey bourbon is that when it's aged, it has to go into a new oak barrel. In other words, the barrel can't be used. It has to be brand new. It has to be made out of oak, and it has to have a char on it. In other words, they shoot like this big flame into the barrel, and they char the inside of the oak. So all bourbon is aged in a new oak charred barrel. And as the distillate goes in, it can't go in any higher than 125 proof. How do they get it from, let's say, 160 down to 125? Well, they add water. And that's the only additive that can be made, that can be added to a bourbon in its aging process. You can't add any additives that add color. You can't put any additives in that add flavor. The only thing you can add to that distillate as it goes in that barrel is water. And then once the aging process has been completed, the whiskey, the bourbon will be pulled out of the barrel and bottled. And now it can't be bottled at any less than 80 proof. You'll never see a bottle of bourbon that's under 80 proof or 40 ABV. So this is what makes bourbon distinctly an American spirit. And it's so important that there's a really interesting thing that happened on May 4th, 1964. Actually, two things happened on May 4th, 1964, that are very interesting. One, I was born. Um, the other thing is that there was a Senate resolution, number 19, that put all of these parameters into place officially to make bourbon America's spirit. So it's uniquely American. Um, there's law passed. And so that's why we can get a fairly consistent bottle of bourbon. There were times when they were putting all sorts of stuff into bourbon, and it was creating some pretty interesting product. And so the government had to get involved um, and kind of regulate it. I'm not a big regulation guy, but in this case, I think it was needed. There was other uh, legislation that happened earlier, the Bottled and Bond Act. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about what that means to bourbon. We're also going to talk about some folklore, some really interesting stories behind bourbon. There was a lot of stuff going on in the 1930s with bourbon. Um, so yeah, buckle up, man. We're going to talk about some great stuff. And if you ever hear anything on this channel that you might want a little more clarification on, or maybe you've got some better information than what I'm putting out there, please, please put it in the comments. Let's talk about it. I'd really like this to be a forum where we all learn together. I don't want it to be just you taking my word for everything. Uh, um, I will do my best to get you very accurate information, but let's have a discussion. Let's dialogue about all this. Maybe you know an interesting story about bourbon and would like to share it. So this is the platform for that. We are all learning bourbon. It's going to be fun. Next video, we're actually going to start sampling some bourbons so that we know which category of bourbon fits our palate the best. We're going to start developing that palate and distinguishing between different categories. We're also going to look at subcategories of bourbon so that when you look at a label, you know exactly what you're looking at. And maybe somebody next to you in the liquor store says, hey, what would you recommend? And you can give that recommendation based off of what you know, and that'll be very helpful. So I'm excited. This is going to be fun. Like I said, next time we get together, we're actually going to be taking some bourbon and doing some blind testing and learning about what our palate likes. So as always, learning bourbon is fun, drinking bourbon is fun, but we want to do it responsibly, and we want to make sure we're safe. Have a good one. See you next time.